Hi, Good evening, everyone. Good to be back at the beginning of 2026, if we can orient ourselves in that way for convenience sake, but more importantly, the beginning of the book of Shmos. And I'm delighted to be able to share some really creative and original thoughts of our friend for the year, Don Yitzchak Abravanel. So let's get to it. I would like to, uh, for reasons of impact, to reverse the sequence of the ideas I want to share with you. So we normally sort of progress from the earlier part of the Sedra and then towards the later one. But for impact, we'll do the other way on this occasion. I want to share with you what Abravanel says about Shal Na'alecha Me'al Raglecha. This is a very famous pasuk, half of a pasuk, when Moshe is the shepherd working on behalf of his father-in-law, and he is deep into the desert, beyond the desert, it says, Achar HaMidbar, and he observes a remarkable phenomenon, a phenomenon that nature would not normally produce or allow, and that is a fire that burns and does not consume the fuel upon which it is sustained. That is to say, of course, the burning bush, it's a thorn bush, v'hasne enenu ukal, is not consumed. So Moshe went to take a look. Now, Abravanel has a lot to say in general on this Sedra. He has about 45 pages of fascinating insight. Of course, I've had to be highly selective in choosing what I want to share for reasons of limited time, naturally, and attention span, I suppose, as well. So he has a lot to say about the burning bush and the incident and the significance and the symbolism, but he especially shares and reveals an fascinating approach to Shal Na'alecha. Hashem speaking through the Malach, through the angel, which in turn was present within the fire that was raging in this bush, says to him, Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha. If you want to find it in your Chumash, if you're with me in the Art Scroll Chumash, you can find it on page 300, or in any Chumash that you may be using. It's Parshas Shmos. It's Perik Gimel. It's chapter 3. We're looking at verse 5. Vayomer al tikrav halom. Do not come too close. Do not come near to here. Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha. Take your shoes off of your feet. Ki hamakom asher ata omed alav. Because the place where you stand, admas kodesh hu, is holy ground. So Moshe takes off his shoes. Actually, it's interesting. There's one of the questions he asks. We don't find that the Torah says Moshe took off his shoes. It's implied Moshe is not going to spurn or defy the divine instruction. And although he seeks to evade the mantle of leadership, of greatness which is thrust upon him, but there's no reason to think that Moshe did not conform to the divine command. But it's interesting that the Torah doesn't say that Moshe did it. Again, probably it's implied. But Abravanel points out that there is a comparative passage elsewhere in the Tanakh, in the book of Yehoshua, where Joshua also is confronted by an angel, and he is told also to take off his shoes, but we'll get to that shortly. But in any case, what is the symbolism of Shal Na'alecha? So Abravanel initially quotes Ralbag. Ralbag was Rav Moshe ben Rav. I'm sorry, not Rav Moshe. Rav Levi ben Gershom. He was possibly a grandson of Ramban. Some places say he was a grandson of Ramban. He wasn't exactly a grandson, but he was apparently related to Ramban, maybe a great nephew of Ramban, and a very important biblical commentator. His Perush on the Torah is not that well known. His parish on the other books of Nevi'im and Ksuvim is perhaps more well known. But in any case, Abravanel quotes him as saying, that the symbolism of the shoes is that when you take off your shoes and you're standing in the sand, or possibly not the sand like on a lovely beach, but more like the wilderness, there are rocks there, there is dirt, there are maybe sharp objects besides that could be insects or other circumstances that could cause a person discomfort besides the heat, or rather the cold. So Ralbag says that when you take off your shoes, it's a way of saying, be alert, be conscious of where you are. Think closely. Don't just be lost in thought about some other matter, but rather, like we say today, be in the moment. Be conscious of where you are and the experience that you are undergoing at this moment. Taking off your shoes has that effect, which Abarbanel quotes him approvingly. But then he goes on to say that Chazal have other interpretations about the symbolism of the fire and the symbolism of the bush. The bush is a very humble plant, and the thorns symbolize the beleaguered state of the Jewish people. And besides that, the thorns symbolize the suffering and the discomfort, and the fire symbolizes the oppression to which they've been subjected by the Egyptians. But at the same time, the punchline, "Ein ukal," it is not destroyed, was not consumed, implying that somehow this humble thorn bush will endure and outlive the fire itself, will somehow not succumb to the raging of the fire, the consumptive power of the fire. This is quite well known. Rashi already alludes to that as well. But now here is the fascinating approach of Abarbanel, which is what I want to share with you in this part of our discussion tonight. Says Abarbanel that the shoes symbolize shal nalechem al raglecha nalaim him remes lamachshavos ha'anushios hagashmios, symbolize the thoughts of man, the physical, maybe the intellectual thoughts of man. But when I say physical stroke intellectual, that which is within the rational contemplation of man, that which represents man's efforts to understand the world around him, to harness the power of nature, to enable a person to gain control over his surroundings. So by putting shoes on your feet, you are able to walk further and faster. You're able to walk to places, in an environment that would be maybe uncomfortable or maybe dangerous without the shoes. Even though I know maybe there are some primitive cultures where they don't wear shoes, but shoes are very, very widespread, even in earliest antiquity, in certainly most parts of the world. The point is that the shoes represent human endeavor, human achievement, human ingenuity as well. And therefore, shal na'alecha means divest yourself of that. Says Abarbanel, Moshe was contemplating, again, the shoes symbolize Moshe was contemplating the plight of the Jewish people. Now, whether he was just contemplating it just by happenstance then, whether he was ruminating on it all the time, or maybe because of the sight of the malach that called to him, at that moment Moshe began to think about the Jewish people. That he doesn't say, but he suggests that Moshe was thinking about the exile of the Jewish people, about the servitude and the suffering of the Jewish people, and about the redemption of the Jewish people. And he was trying to understand it, what brought it about, what was the cause, what was the resolution to it. And Abarbanel, without going into it at length now, says that's why Hashem said, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Yitzhak, the God of Yaakov, to say that the Jewish people are in exile because Abraham was entered into the covenant between the parts in which he was told that his descendants will be foreigners in a foreign land. And the exile began with the birth of Yitzchak. And it was Yaakov who was told, don't be afraid of going down to Mitzrayim, because I will go with you and I will bring you up eventually as well. So this was, of course, the context of Hashem's revelation to Moshe. Says Abarbanel, Moshe himself was thinking along those lines as well, but he was thinking about the cause and the resolution and the solution through human means, through human endeavor, or maybe even through spiritual endeavors as well. But Moshe was not initially, of course, expecting or imagining what was in store for him. So therefore, the Malach told him, "Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha," that don't think about like human causes and human sequences of events that can be explained naturally or can be anticipated or analyzed in a geopolitical fashion or in a psychological fashion or in a diplomatic fashion. There is something much more profound and more wondrous that is afoot, if you excuse the pun. Interestingly, now to explain what he says about Yehoshua. So he points out that in the case of Yehoshua, it's if you're interested, if you have it to hand, you can find it in the book of Joshua, Yehoshua, in Perek, chapter 5, verse 13. Perhaps I'll read the English for simplicity's sake. It happened when Yehoshua was in Yericho, he raised his eyes and saw, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. Yehoshua went towards him and said, "Are you with us or are you with our enemies?" Halanu ata im litzarenu. So the man in this vision, in this apparition, said, "No, for I am a commander of Hashem's legion. Now I have come." Which Chazal have an interpretation of that, but it's not for now. Yehoshua fell before him to the ground and prostrated himself and said to him, "What does my master say to his servant?" Meaning, you have come, you've revealed yourself to me clearly for a reason. What is your message? Vayomer sar tzava Hashem el Yehoshua, and the like commander of God's legion said to Yehoshua, "Shal na'alcha me'al raglecha." Take your shoes off of your feet. Ki hamakom asher ata omed alav kodesh hu. The place we are standing is holy. Vayas Yehoshua came, and Yehoshua did it. So it's interesting. The similarities, of course, are unmistakable. But notice that in the case of Yehoshua, the angel told him, "Shal na'alcha," in the singular. Now, clearly, the intent is both his shoes. Doesn't mean just one shoe, but it's couched in the singular language. And in the case of Moshe, he was told, "Shal na'alecha." Also, the similarity, "Makom asher tamed alav kodeshu," the place where you're standing is holy. And it says in Yehoshua, "Vayas Yehoshua came," doesn't say that about Moshe. So says Abarbanel as follows. The case of Yehoshua in some ways was similar. Of course, Joshua is charged with the mission of bringing the Jewish people into the promised land, and he has to conquer the land, and in particular, he has to conquer Jericho. And Jericho was like the luck of the land of Canaan, like they say about Stirling Castle. It's the luck to Scotland. Well, Jericho was the luck to the land of Canaan. One could not think of conquering Canaan without conquering Jericho, and Jericho was therefore very heavily fortified. Yehoshua was thinking, how am I going to conquer this city? And probably he had a plan or a few plans, from surprise attack, headlong attack, whatever it might be. I'm sure he was contemplating a lot of different possibilities. That's take off your shoes. Abandon your thoughts about military strategy. The city of Jericho is not, will not, or maybe cannot be conquered through the power of military might alone, of which the Jewish nation probably had limited military prowess insofar as military might is concerned. Initially, they were afraid even to venture along the path of the Philistines because of the fear of armed resistance. Okay, I'm not saying they were completely without resources, but the point is, according to Abarbanel, and really that's the pshat as well, that Hashem was saying to Yehoshua, the city of Jericho can be conquered and will be conquered through divine inspiration, through divine providence. And therefore he said, Shal na'alcha me'al raglecha. The place where you're standing is holy. Says Abarbanel, what is the meaning of that metaphor, the place where you are standing? So he says that it can be understood, Anmas Kodesh Romez El Yericho Bifrat, V'nikra Ha'iyun. I'm sorry, he explains that the reason Yoshua was told just Na'alcha in the singular, Yoshua only had one thing on his mind at that juncture: how to conquer Yehoshua, how to conquer Yericho. He was thinking about, as I said, the approach, the manpower, the military prowess, the weaponry, whether to build a ramp, which is how they used to try to conquer a walled city in antiquity, even in medieval times. Um, and that was on his mind. Therefore, because he was thinking about one important primary subject, so therefore na'alcha is in the singular. In the case of Moshe, he was thinking about much grander, broader issues, or you could say challenges. How did the Jewish people get into exile in the first place? How did they sink to such a low level of degeneracy and depravity? How is it that they have come to be persecuted mercilessly by a sadistic people? And what is the means of their survival, and what is the means of their redemption? Moshe was contemplating the full sweep of Jewish destiny. Therefore, the Malach told him, Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha. Take off both your shoes, because Moshe, so to speak, was contemplating the most profound and wide-ranging subjects that touch on and like exemplify Jewish destiny itself. Why does it say in the case of Yehoshua that he did so, Vayas Cain? In the case of Moshe, it doesn't say that he did anything. So he has an answer for that as well. So, I'm sorry, I want to get back to Makom. He says that Makom, the place, and the Adamah as well, can be seen as a metaphor for careful, like, contemplation. Like Hashem said to Moshe later on, he said, Hine makom iti. Hashem said to Moshe after the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe said, reveal to me your plan for the world, the algorithm by which you determine human events. So Hashem said, Hine makom iti v'nitzavta al hatzur. So their makom is not meant as a particular address that you can find on Google Maps or something like that. Hine makom iti, Hashem says, there's a place with me. It's a way of saying you need to contemplate deeply. You need ultimately to seek the endowment of the divine spirit, which of course is exactly what Moshe was experiencing at this time of this encounter at the burning bush. So Makom Iti and Admas Kodesh, by extension, Makom and Adama, are meant in the same way. So according to this, says Abarbanel, Moshe was told to abandon your rational or human analysis, because the true explanation and the true, redemption, the actual redemption of the Jewish people will come about through miraculous and supernatural means, through direct divine providence and intervention. The reason that it says in the case of Yehoshua Vayas Cain is that Yehoshua was proposing or intending to launch a military campaign. The Malach told him, forget it, abandon that idea. It's not going to happen that way. So Vayas Cain Yehoshua did so. He was told, don't think about military conquest through natural means, but rather Hashem has a much greater plan that is going to unfold. In the case of Moshe, Moshe wasn't planning to do anything in particular, and Hashem did not instruct him to do anything in particular, other than to accept the mantle of leadership and to go and to approach Paro. But it's not as if Moshe had a particular plan to redeem the Jewish people, and Hashem told him, no, do it in a different way. That was the case with Yehoshua. He had a plan to conquer Yericho, and Hashem said, no, don't do it that way. I'll tell you how to do it. With the Kohanim, with circling around 7 times, 7 days, blowing the shofar, etc. So therefore, Vayas Ken Yoshua, Yoshua unsurprisingly, conform to the divine instruction. In the case of Moshe, of course, it's implied that Moshe did it, but Moshe's uh, like initial intention and subsequent intention were not radically different. Moshe was thinking as best he could with human understanding of the Galus and the Geula, and Hashem said, no, it's something much more grand, much more transcendent, and the means by which the Jewish people will be redeemed is through supernatural divine intervention, and you, Moshe, are going to be the instrument through which that will unfold. So this is what Abarbanel says about Shal Na'alecha Me'al Raglecha. We have limited time left, a bit less time than I had hoped, for, if you like, the punchline of what I want to share with you tonight. And this relates to Abravanel's thoughts on the early career of Moshe. What we were discussing right now is the beginning of his career as a prophet. You could say that whatever we know about Moshe until now is a prelude to his assuming the mantle of leadership, becoming the redeemer, the lawgiver, the miracle worker, the almost transcendent figure that Moshe will become, or is becoming. I say almost transcendent because although he was human, but when he went up to Har Sinai, he communed with the angels, and his human frailties, let's say, were diminished, and his spiritual greatness became, beyond human comprehension. And that all begins with the encounter at the burning bush. What about before that? So we do know a bit about Moshe before. Of course, we know he was born, but Moshe didn't have too much a role in those events when he was discovered by the daughter of Paro, the princess. Again, Moshe did not have any agency in those events, of course, in his very early infancy. However, as he grows up, we have the statement in the Torah, without knowing exactly how old he is, Vayigdal Moshe grew up, and he went out of the palace, Vayitzei Lechav, and he went to see his brethren, Vayar B'Sivlo Sam, and he saw their suffering. So we'll get back to that in a moment, but Abravanel doesn't dwell, at least in what I want to share with you right now, on that first phrase that he saw their suffering, but he does mention three events that happened in the the backstory of Moshe, the pre-prophetic career of Moshe. Those three events are, and he says that actually they did not happen sequentially in quick proximity, close proximity to one another. There was actually a long delay because he suggests Moshe was maybe 20 years old when he went out to see his brethren, and he saw an Egyptian taskmaster who was mercilessly beating, apparently with lethal intent, a Hebrew slave, and Moshe intervened and he knocked off the Egyptian taskmaster and he hid him in the sand. That's the first event. It says that the next day he went out and he saw two Hebrew slaves who were fighting with one another. And again, they had come to blows. Moshe rebuked the aggressor, probably neither than were that righteous, to be honest. But in any case, he rebuked the aggressor, and that whoever that was, we have a tradition about it, but the Torah doesn't mention their names at this point, said, Halahageni Talmer, do you propose to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And Moshe realized the matter has now become public knowledge, or at least there are others who know about what happened, and Paro heard about it as well, and Moshe had to flee. Then the third event that the Torah tells us about is that Moshe arrived in Midian, and he rocks up at the well, and he saw the daughters of Yitro, he had 7 daughters, and they were watering their flock, or trying to do so, and they were accosted by some shepherds who were not the most refined people around, certainly according to our tradition, and Moshe saved the girls from the unwelcome attention of the shepherds, as a result of which they came home early, and their father said, and they say, well, we were saved by an Egyptian man. Says Abravanel, Moshe was, at the time he stood before Paro, which presumably was not long after he arrived in Midian, because it says that he became a shepherd to his father-in-law. He was 80 years old when he stood before Paro. Now, perhaps he was in Midian for a few years, probably not that long, because it seems he didn't have many children. Maybe he had one child, he had another child only slightly after. But Kitzur, in brief, Abravanel says that they were talking about an interval of about 60 years. The incident with the daughters of Yitro, of whom Tzipporah was the eldest whom he would marry, happened long after the other two events. Says Abravanel, now with that having set the context, Abravanel says that the Torah tells us about these events because they reflect the greatness of Moshe and the qualities that made him worthy to be a prophet and to be a leader. He even says, quite interesting, that Moshe was raised in the palace of Pharaoh and he learned some useful things there. He learned about leadership. He learned about taking responsibility. Pharaoh is responsible for the whole country. Moshe learned about taking responsibility for others, not looking away or ignoring events that happen to others who are perhaps subject to his influence or attention, people for whom he should bear a responsibility. Says Abravanel, interestingly, he learned that from Paro. I wonder if maybe almost subconsciously Abravanel was alluding to the fact that he also moved in the circles of royalty in Portugal, in Spain. By the way, it wasn't only Abravanel. Don Isaac Abravanel was his father and grandfather before him, even in previous generations as well. So he was from a distinguished family who were schooled in the ways of statecraft and who also shared the company of great people, prominent people, influential people, sometimes villainous people as well. But I'm talking about the rulership. And so Abravanel maybe perhaps subconsciously refers to that. And therefore, he says, this is what made Moshe worthy of being a prophet. He says, even though in Egypt, so he came out of the palace, but in Midian, when he was a fugitive in a foreign land where he was trying to escape the sword of Pharaoh, Moshe did not have prominence or influence or power or authority, and still he intervened to help those who were being persecuted. V'gam lo b'midyan she'ager uvoreach. He was a sojourner, he was a stranger, he was an alien, he was a fugitive. V'lamad mezeh sheMoshe ya betiva utchunaso tzaddik. Moshe by his nature was righteous, v'yashar and upright, v'gadol halev, and he had a heart which encompassed the needs of those around him. Ve'hein amidos haru'uyos el hanavi. These are qualities which are appropriate for a prophet, v'hamechinos el hanavua be'emes, and are the genuine properties that ready a person for the gift of prophecy. It's interesting how Abravanel is like almost associating or almost interchanging leadership and prophecy. And that's not surprising because, as we know, those are indeed closely connected. Not every leader is a prophet, but every prophet should be a leader in some way. To get to my punchline, I read many years ago an essay based on the writings of Reb Simcha Zissel Ziv, the Alter of Kelm. And he writes something quite similar. I don't know whether he saw Abravanel. Maybe he did. He doesn't mention Abravanel. Or at least not in the citation that I've seen. But he observes that there's a kind of progression here. Initially, Moshe went out to his brethren. He went out of the palace and he took an interest in their well-being, even though they were slaves and he was a prince born, raised in the palace, but he identified with them. He shared in their distress and he felt a sense of profound kinship to others. beyond that, not just in a kind of general way, but even in a specific way. When he saw a particular instance of a Jew who was being persecuted, who was being beaten, he intervened to save him. That's the uh, killing the Mitzri. In the next incident that the Torah mentions, it wasn't only when a Jewish person was being harmed or attacked by an Egyptian taskmaster or thug, but even when two Jewish people were quarreling. He didn't simply say, well, it's not my issue. Who do I know who is right or who is wrong? He saw someone preparing to land a blow on his rival and he rebuked him for it. So we see Moshe's concern. He has that quality which we call in Hebrew ichpatiut. He cares. He cares about others. And then the fourth sort of illustration, which, as we're saying, there's a kind of progression. He cares about the Jewish people generally. He cares about the Jewish people specifically in a particular instance. He intervenes even when two people are fighting with one another, both fellow Jews, and he rebukes the one who is the aggressor. But even when he might logically say, it's not my issue, has got nothing to do with me, he sees Midianite shepherds who are molesting Midianite women, and he intervenes on their behalf as well. This is the greatness of Moshe, and this is what prepares, I should say, this is the backstory, this is what prepares Moshe for greatness. And this in turn, and we'll end with the following little story, is reflected in a very moving, remarkable essay published about 20 years ago or more in the Columbia Business School magazine called Hermes. It was published in 2001, and it's based, I think, on a lecture or a talk or a commencement address, possibly, by Howard Schultz, not Charles Schultz. He did the Peanuts. Howard Schultz, you possibly know, built Starbucks, and he remains influential there, and he relates how sometime, I don't know, maybe around the year 2000, approximately, I'm thinking, he was in Israel. And he went with some other Jewish businessmen, I'm sure prominent people, to meet the Mir Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, late Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. And we don't have time to review it at length. It's worthwhile looking up. You can find it online. It's called Blanket of Trust. But I'll just tell you the story briefly. He was with maybe 8 or 10 other business leaders, and the Rosh Yeshiva walked into the room. You may or may not know that Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, sadly, towards the latter part of his life, was stricken with Parkinson's. But he would not let it hold him back, although eventually he did succumb to it. But he was very reluctant to take medication because he did not want it to compromise his ability to think and to speak and to learn and to teach. And he used to shake sometimes uncontrollably. It was a bit uncomfortable even to be in his presence sometimes because of that. Anyway, he said to these business leaders, he said, I know that you're very busy, so let's just, I won't take much of your time. He said, look at me. They didn't want to look at him even because it's kind of embarrassing, the way he was shaking. I once had an audience with the Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel. To be honest, maybe I should be ashamed, but I also felt uncomfortable in his presence because of it. He was just seemed so frail. But in any case, that is part of the story because he said, gentlemen, what lesson can we learn from the Holocaust? So Schultz says how they were like trying to avoid his gaze, like children in the fifth year five in school. They're afraid to look up. So one of the executives called on one of them and he said, we must learn never to forget. So Schultz said, I thought that was a pretty good answer, but Rabbi Finkel said, no, that's nothing. Then he asked somebody else, and he said, "Never be a bystander. Never, ignore the peril of others." But he said, "You guys don't get it. Let me tell you what is the essence of the human spirit." And he described how, I don't know if it was on one particular instance or typically that the Holocaust victims, Jews, were rounded up and put in cattle cars, etc. And finally, when they got to a labor camp and they were freezing cold, the Nazis issued one blanket for every six people. And whoever had the blanket had the choice to try to warm himself with that blanket or to push it to five others so that they could share the blanket and that he would not survive alone while others froze. He said that is the essence of the human spirit. And he said to these executives, now go back to America and push your blanket to five other people. This is the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he felt that sense of responsibility towards others. And according to Abarbanel, this is why the Torah tells us about those events in his backstory, because they contributed to the great personality. I mean, that's of course uh, doing an injustice to say Moshe was a great personality, but that is the foundation of his ascent to greatness as a prophet and as the leader and the redeemer of the Jewish people. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a wonderful Shabbos.